You sit in a wooden chair. 12 strangers surround you. One of them is about to decide your fate or your freedom. But here's what you don't know. What happens behind that closed jury room door is nothing like what you see on television. And sometimes it's far darker than anyone in that courtroom could have imagined. This is the verdict room, and today we're exposing 7 jury room secrets that have overturned murder convictions, destroyed innocent lives, and exposed the shocking vulnerabilities in how American justice actually works. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear has changed murder trials forever. The jury is supposed to be the conscience of the community. 12 impartial citizens sworn to uphold the law, tasked with one sacred duty: to separate guilt from innocence beyond a reasonable doubt. But the American justice system has a fatal blind spot. Once those jurors close that deliberation room door, what happens inside stays inside. No cameras, no recordings, no judge watching. Just 12 people, a verdict form, and the power to lock someone away for life, or set them free. For decades, what happened behind that door was almost impossible to investigate. But in recent years, wrongful conviction cases, appeals, and testimonies from jurors themselves have pulled back the curtain. And what we've found is deeply disturbing. Let's start with the lie that changed everything. In 2023, a juror in a high-profile murder trial was questioned after the verdict came down. During jury selection, the process called voir dire, where lawyers question potential jurors about their biases, this juror swore he had no personal connection to the case. He swore he could be impartial. He swore he would base his decisions solely on evidence presented in court. He was lying. After the guilty verdict was announced, it came out that this juror knew the defendant personally. He had a history with him. Not just casual acquaintance, real history. History that should have disqualified him from the jury box entirely. The defense attorney who discovered this later said in an interview that this single juror may have poisoned the entire jury room deliberation. His personal grudge wasn't based on the evidence. It was based on something the jury should have never heard. This isn't an isolated incident. The Innocence Project has documented case after case where jurors lied during voir dire, about criminal records they had, about family members who were victims of crime, about prejudices they claimed they didn't have. One juror failed to disclose that she was a domestic violence survivor during a case involving domestic violence charges. Her personal trauma bled into her deliberations. She voted guilty based on her own fear, not the evidence. Here's the brutal reality. There's no foolproof way to detect these lies. Lawyers ask questions, jurors answer, and if they're convincing liars, the system has no defense. Now imagine this scenario. The jury room door closes. Deliberations begin, and almost immediately, one juror emerges as dominant, aggressive, loud, and absolutely convinced of guilt. In a landmark study of jury deliberations, researchers found something shocking. Jurors who speak first and speak loudest often control the entire verdict, regardless of the evidence. One case that illustrates this involved a robbery conviction in 2019. During post-trial interviews, jurors revealed that one woman on the jury had basically bullied the other 11 into voting guilty. She spoke with such certainty, such aggression, that quieter jurors who actually had doubts, simply gave up. They didn't want confrontation. They didn't want to be the one holdout. One juror later said in an affidavit, "I didn't actually believe he was guilty, but I was so tired of being argued with that I just voted guilty to end it." Think about that for a moment. A man's freedom was decided not by evidence, but by jury room exhaustion. This phenomenon is so well documented that it's sometimes called verdict-driven deliberation. One person decides the verdict first, then spends the rest of deliberations convincing everyone else. The jury isn't weighing evidence together. It's following one person's lead. Here's something that will keep you awake at night. Jurors are explicitly instructed not to research the case on their own. Don't Google the defendant. Don't look up the law. Don't read news articles. Stay in the courtroom. Base your decision only on what you hear in court. But in 2026, with smartphones in every pocket, enforcing that rule is virtually impossible. In a 2024 criminal case in California, a juror admitted, after the verdict, that she had Googled the defendant during a lunch break. She found his arrest record from 20 years ago. A prior conviction, something the judge had explicitly ruled inadmissible because it was prejudicial. She brought that information into the jury room, she shared it with other jurors, and it shaped their entire verdict. The defendant was convicted, he appealed, he won. The conviction was overturned based on juror misconduct. But that's the exception. Most cases, this outside research never gets discovered. Jurors don't confess, verdicts stand, and innocent people remain in prison. One judge in a 2025 ruling acknowledged the problem directly. In the age of the internet, the jury room is no longer isolated. Every juror has access to unlimited information, and we have almost no way to police it. Now let's talk about something the legal system is still grappling with in 2026, racial bias in the jury room. In a groundbreaking analysis of jury deliberations by researchers at Northwestern Law School, one pattern emerged with devastating clarity. When a black defendant faces a majority white jury, the jury room conversations change. Jurors make assumptions. They use different standards of proof. They ask different questions. One documented case involved a 2021 murder trial in the Midwest. During post-trial interviews, white jurors admitted they had applied a higher standard of evidence to the black defendant than they would have to a white defendant in the same situation. One juror actually said, "I just felt like I needed to be more careful because I didn't want to be accused of being racist, so I was harder on him." Wait, let that sink in. In trying not to be racist, they became more suspicious. They assumed guilt more readily. They deliberated longer and with more skepticism. The defendant was convicted. Years later, new evidence surfaced. DNA evidence that should have exonerated him earlier. He was finally released after 7 years in prison. But those 7 years happened because of invisible bias in a jury room, bias that nobody could prove was happening while it was happening. This isn't about jurors being intentionally racist. Most aren't. But unconscious bias, the automatic assumptions our brains make based on race, appearance, and stereotype, operates in jury rooms just like it operates everywhere else. And in a jury room, those biases are amplified. They're shared. They become consensus. Here's something most people don't realize. The judge cannot hear jury deliberations. The judge doesn't know what's being said. The judge doesn't know if jurors are following instructions or ignoring them. The judge is completely blind to what's happening in that room. In a 2022 federal case, a judge gave very specific instructions about how jurors should evaluate circumstantial evidence. The instructions were complex, technical, and absolutely critical to a fair verdict. But after the trial, jurors admitted they had basically ignored those instructions. They didn't understand them. They thought the judge's instructions were too confusing, so they just voted based on gut feeling. The defendant appealed. The appeal court said, "This is a serious problem, but we can't overturn the verdict just because jurors might have misunderstood instructions." The conviction stood. In another case, a judge instructed jurors that they must find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a critical legal standard. But in post-trial interviews, several jurors admitted they didn't really know what reasonable doubt meant. One juror thought it meant any doubt at all. Another thought it meant the prosecutor didn't prove guilt to my personal satisfaction. These aren't the same thing. A reasonable doubt has a legal meaning. But without explanation, without the judge able to verify understanding, jurors just guess. This is where it gets really troubling. Sometimes jurors vote guilty without the evidence even being presented. In a 2023 case in the South, a defendant was charged with assault. During deliberations, jurors started voting immediately. Guilty, guilty, guilty. But then one juror asked a critical question. Wait, did the prosecutor actually prove he threw the first punch? Or did the victim throw the first punch? Long silence. No one could remember. The evidence about who initiated the violence, the central question of the case, was unclear to them. But they'd already voted. Most wanted to stick with their guilty votes. Changing your vote feels like admitting you were wrong. It feels like flip-flopping. So even though they couldn't actually recall the evidence supporting their verdict, they stayed with it. One juror later said in an affidavit, "We voted without really remembering the facts. We just knew he seemed guilty to us." Seemed guilty, not proven guilty, seemed. So what happens when these jury secrets come to light? When appeals courts discover that jurors lied, or were biased, or ignored evidence, or brought in outside information. Sometimes convictions are overturned. The defendant gets a new trial, and if they're lucky, and it takes luck, they're exonerated. But the process is brutally slow. It takes years, sometimes decades. In the meantime, innocent people sit in prison. Their families wait. Justice moves at a glacial pace. In July 2026, just this month, the news broke. A Brooklyn man who had been wrongfully convicted won his appeal. Years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. DNA evidence eventually cleared him. But the jury that convicted him, that jury room, that verdict, it destroyed his life. And it happened, in part, because of secrets no one would ever know, until it was too late. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: how can we trust a system where what decides our guilt or innocence happens behind a closed door? Where we can't verify that jurors understood the law? Where we can't prove they weren't biased? Where they can lie during selection and face almost no consequences? Some jurisdictions are experimenting with solutions. Jury instructions that are clearer, more accessible, in plain language. Better voir dire questioning. Recording deliberations in some cases, but these reforms are slow, inconsistent, and far from universal. The jury system is built on an assumption that 12 ordinary citizens, with good faith and a commitment to justice, will deliberate fairly. It's a beautiful ideal, but behind closed doors, in jury rooms across America, that ideal collides with human nature, with bias, with exhaustion, with personality conflicts, with the desire to go home. The verdict you receive might depend less on the evidence against you and more on whether the person sitting next to you in that jury box is having a good day. And that's not justice, that's a gamble. So here's what we want to know. Have you served on a jury? What was your experience? Did you see bias? Did you see someone dominate the deliberations? Tell us in the comments below. Your story matters, because the only way we fix this broken system is by understanding how broken it really is. If you believe our justice system needs reform, subscribe to The Verdict Room. We investigate the cases that change law. We expose the truths that the system tries to keep hidden. New video every week. Thank you for watching. And remember, the verdict is only as fair as the jurors deciding it.